Hi there. Welcome once again to Prices at the Pumps, our weekly look every Wednesday at all things energy related. I'm Scott Squires. Pleased to be joined, as always, by Dan McTagg, the energy expert. And Dan, a couple things on the agenda today, but where we always like to start is with prices at the pumps. In Atlantic Canada, prices adjusted Thursdays and Fridays. So that's coming up. What can consumers expect the next couple of days in this region, Dan?
Scott, terrific news. Look, if you can hold off, wait until Thursday in Newfoundland and Friday, if you can do the same for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI, because we're going to see about a 5.5 cent decrease for gasoline. That's right, 5.5 cents, maybe more, maybe just a little bit less, but it's going down. And if you have to use diesel or home heating fuel, furnace oil, diesel is going down 6.4 cents a liter. So this is reflecting what's happened right across North America over the past week. Regulated markets mean, of course, is a bit of a holdback. You've had to wait a few extra days, but book those decreases in. And the last thing you should be doing is visiting a gas station today. Wait until tomorrow or Friday, depending where you are in Atlantic Canada.
So good news right across the Atlantic region, Dan. And I've asked you this before, but all indications would seem to say that prices should perhaps be going up. Why are we seeing this continual downward trend, Dan?
Yeah, look, this time last year, though, oil was trading pretty much where it was until yesterday, where it collapsed 3%, but it's back up this morning. It has to do with the overall belief that OPEC did not make good on its commitment to cut production and that demand is somehow to be dented. In other words, demand is not quite there. I'm not sure that's clear. It certainly isn't evidenced by the data, but markets no longer function based on concern about supply and demand. You would think they would, but Scott, as you and I have discussed many times here on SaltWire, the market is driven by hedgers, to a larger extent, artificial intelligence, things that are being used in terms of how to figure out where prices are going to go based on externalities that have very little to do with, the fundamentals. So what this really means is that, energy markets can't really find a footing. And so they have been shedding their positions rather dramatically in the belief that, in particular, the United States has so much oil out there that they can supply the world. That, of course, isn't true. And we know that sooner or later, OPEC's numbers are going to have to be considered. And that's that they have cut back production and that demand continues to be very strong and robust, especially as we head through 2024. Bottom line, though, it's great news for consumers. And let's take advantage of the mayhem in markets and put a few more dollars in our pockets, maybe a few extra gifts under that Christmas tree.
Hey, who doesn't like more gifts under the tree, right, Dan?
You got it.
And again, you're right. Great news for consumers. I know for me, sometimes I don't worry about all of the external forces. I just know that when I go to the pump, if I grab the nozzle and the price is less than it was the last time, that makes me feel good. And just imagine, Dan, if we didn't have a couple of carbon taxes on there, what we'd be paying per liter, right? Roughly what would we be paying? So right now, it's around mid to low 150s here in Nova Scotia for regular self-serve, unleaded. What would we be looking at minus those carbon taxes? Just curiously.
Well, Nova Scotia would be down 20 cents a liter to $1.30. So, and a little bit more for diesel and home heating fuel, but not home heating because the first carbon tax certainly applies to it. Sorry, the second carbon tax applies to it, not necessarily the first, given the exemption. But the numbers would also be stronger if we had a Canadian dollar that wasn't as weak as it is now, 135, 136 pennies. That's adding about another 20 cents. If we didn't have all of these policies, these so-called green policies, climate policies, what falls under the rubric of net zero, you'd probably be paying about $1.05, $1.10 for a liter of gasoline. So, anybody who thinks it's something that they can, simply look away and say it's no big deal, 40 cents a liter buys a lot of other things, including food. And it would also probably tame the inflation belt in this country, especially with things like food and other products. Bottom line, if Canada got its act together, started selling a little bit more of what the world desperately wants, our natural gas and our oil, given our massive reserves, I think Canadians would have a little bit of a wider stride in their step.
And Dan, certainly an event that's been grabbing a lot of headlines in the energy sector as well as the climate world. was COP28, the climate conference that took place over a couple of weeks in Dubai. You and I have talked about it the last couple of weeks. Was there anything coming out of that that caught your attention that you feel you wanted to maybe just chat about here?
Well, apart from saying same old, and I'm not one to pull punches. I worked for and try to help a candidate named Morris Strong, who was really the first one to launch these things many generations ago. I think it's unfortunate that you have a federal government that has decided to impose emissions caps on methane, which we're already doing a very good job at here in Canada. And that would only be on oil and gas. It doesn't deal with, say, for instance, the methane emanating from the Quebec hydro dams, which are greater than all the number of cows we have in North America. And that brings me to the second point. Cow burps are now going to be subject to ways of controlling emissions. I guess they just don't want us eating beef. And finally, the actual emissions caps itself in the oil and gas sector. You give a pass to every other industry, but you do nothing but to attack the oil and gas sector. It seems to me that being that it is the largest revenue generator by which your social programs and mine are paid, if you want to cut into that, if you want to hurt and drive up the cost of energy, what I consider a third carbon tax, and you make that announcement in another part of the world just to be cool and trendy, as Stephen Guilbeault and Justin Trudeau have done, well, then maybe there has to be some kind of accounting for this. The government is obviously making policies and decisions which have not met the test of public approval. That's demonstrated what happened in Atlantic Canada this last summer with the 2 carbon tax imposed. When a government loses the moral right to govern and to provide these policies, it's high time that we have an election to make these decisions for Canadians. Canadians believe in that, and they're willing to pay for it through the nose and destroy a significant portion of their economy. Doing it, then I'm good with that. If that's what the public wants, then great. But I got a sneaking suspicion as a Liberal member of Parliament of 18 years and many before that in the trenches of that party, the public is not supporting this. Certainly not when you see countries like India, China, South Korea, and others, and Pakistan increasing their so-called emissions, while Canada's tied to a whipping post and told that it's got to punish itself. It doesn't make sense. It's absurd. It's bizarre. It's warped. And it ought to be at least subjected to an electoral, the acid test of an electoral outcome.
Something that I think is important to mention before I move on and talk about nuclear energy is, I enjoy following you and being connected to you on social media, in particular X, formerly Twitter. But I see a lot of times posters will comment on things that you've posted or reply to you and basically saying that you're a climate denier. Now, I want to give you a chance here. I know we've done this before, but in talking to you and getting to know you over the last couple of years, what I garner from you is that you're for a more tempered approach, not just going full steam ahead without looking before you leap, and taking a more measured approach that, yes, there's some good things. Yes, we need to think about climate and getting more, renewables and things of that nature. But Dan, again, maybe just for those who are a little confused by your stance or your position, maybe just again here in your own words, talk about what it is that you'd like to see happen in terms of fossil fuels, oil and gas, renewable energies, and so on.
Well, I think people use labels because it's easier for them not to have that discussion and engage in reality. I'm a climate reality. I'm a pragmatic person who says if we do these policies, they have to be sound. They have to be purposeful. They have to have the human at heart, not the reduction of the human condition or to tell people what they can and cannot do. If we are concerned about one molecule, CO2, then I simply put the calculation back to them. Canada produces 1.5% of CO2. Of that CO2, humankind is responsible for 3% of CO2 in the atmosphere, of which we're talking 0.04%. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, but you should be a scientist to recognize that is about as likely that a grain of salt on the Confederation Bridge would bring down that bridge. That's, of course, how absurd we're talking in terms of the actual science behind it. I think once we start to parse some facts and figures about where we are heading and are concerned about weather, which wasn't around 20 years ago. And when it was around, it was being promoted by people, as I mentioned at the outset, Maurice Strong, who I knew very well. But the man, obviously, not to speak ill of the dead, the man obviously had an agenda. And the agenda was to consider that the world would come to an end long before the 28th COP forum took place. I think people need to step back a little bit and say, all of the things that you want to achieve can't yet be achieved with the technology we currently have. We can try that. The technology that we have had, things like nuclear, things like natural gas, these are extremely important forms of energy. And if you don't have them, well, then you're going to reduce society. And I take the comment of the president of the COP28, Sultan Al Jaber's comments that this would have us living in caves. And I don't think that we want to do that. I think what we want to do is take a practical approach to this. But throwing, market destroying subsidies out there, trying to virtue signal that somehow you have the best idea on, what constitutes a decent weather system. I mean, even the evidence on weather has changed so dramatically. My colleague and friend, Dr. Ross McKittrick, has produced yet another example of that demonstrates that humanity has faced warmer weather in the past, in particular in the 11th century, where it was a lot warmer than today. And I don't think, the instruments that were used at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 had anything to do with driving the climate. So I think we need to, as my kids would say, chill, step back a little bit, and look before we leap. We haven't done any of that. And instead, we're committing billions of dollars, and I think an unnecessary debate over what we ought to do. At the very least, if as Canadians we understand that CO2 is a problem, then why we have a prime minister in this country saying there's no business case to sending natural gas to places like Japan and Germany? To me, if you want to stop China from belching out more coal, they're building a plant every week while we do very little, or we're trying to find ways to slow down our emissions. Then it seems to me that the way in which we should do this is build more pipelines of natural gas and get our products to the global markets, in particular prevent those from putting more of that carbon into the atmosphere. If in fact we consider carbon a pollutant, that's also a misnomer. It's a dishonest misnomer. Carbon and CO2 is not a pollutant. It's very much a part of what gives life. I realize this is a long answer to a short question, but I think people have to understand that we need to be more realistic about these things, and simply assigning labels that are convenient and cool and trendy doesn't advance the idea that renewables that we're talking about, EVs, solars, and photovoltaics, things like solar panels, are great, but most of them are made in China, and they're made with some of the dirtiest conditions in the world. We have to ask ourselves, how are we going to achieve what we want to achieve on the belief that somehow the world's coming to an end, which is repeated to us every year when we have these COP meetings.
Well, it's interesting that you say that as well, Dan, because it segues me into something else that I wanted to talk to you about. And look, I mean, I want to leave a better world for my children, grandchildren, and further generations. I do my best to recycle and to reduce, reuse, recycle, try to be as green as possible. I don't drive an EV. I have to drive the gas vehicle that I have, but I want to leave a better future, as most do. But I also believe, as you said, that discussion is important, and looking at both sides and looking at all the information that surrounds a topic. And something came across my timeline recently. It was a quote from Jim Ski, who's the new head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And he gave an interview in Der Spiegel. He's given lots of other interviews. You can find him on YouTube, etc. But he was quoted as saying, "The world won't end if it warms by more than 1.5 degrees. We should not despair and fall into a state of shock if global temperatures were to increase by this amount." And again, that's from Jim Ski, head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in an interview he gave to Der Spiegel. Again, lots of information out there, two sides of that. Some might push back on that. But when you hear someone as learned as this gentleman say that, what comes to your mind, Dan?
Well, 1.5 degrees in 180 years. I mean, we've been through this before. The 11th century, it happened in the 16th century. I think we also have to keep in mind that our ability and capacity to make amends and to accommodate when we have these kind of situations is certainly important to reflect upon. We're very adaptable, but I also note that in the world, and it doesn't matter what year you take, The statistics are very clear and unimpeachable. More people die of cold related, factors than die of warm. We're warm blooded. We're not reptiles. And so, not to say that dismissively, there's a number of reasons why we see variations in temperature and why we see variations in weather. And a lot of them have to do with the oceans, they have to do with the sun, and they may very well have a bit to do with what we are doing as humans. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that that is not a factor. But if we think we can control things like carbon taxes and fooling around with the miracle of hydrocarbons, which has given us, I mean, Scott, in your time and mine, I was just listening to one of the beautiful Christmas songs the other day, feed the world. We remember that in 1985. You don't hear that anymore. We've succeeded in ensuring that we have a growing population, more people being able to live with, with the ability to make ends meet, primarily because of the miracle of hydrocarbons. So things like coal, things like oil, and things like natural gas. We have to be responsible in their use, but let's not ignore or deny, because they like using that word, the reality that thanks to the proper, responsible use of hydrocarbons, we have a society and civilization that is advancing. And by the way, real pollution, NOx, SOx, particulates, they're all down, except in countries where, of course, they don't obey those. But if we're looking at Canada, we're not doing too damn bad. And that's not to sit on our laurels. I know it's a Canadian thing, never to congratulate yourself, but we're doing a bang up job. And the only Debbie Downers are the ones out there playing the climate bedwetting game. And I'm not going to put up with it.
Dan, I referenced nuclear a few minutes ago. And again, another post. I always like to check X for all kinds of stuff, sports, energy, you name it.
Yep.
But you and I have talked about nuclear energy quite a bit, and we really dug into it a few months ago and kind of wondering why it wasn't more prevalent in Canada. And I saw this post from a Brian Gitt on X, and he says, nuclear energy is cleaner than solar and wind. It's also low cost, reliable, and safe. And he says, so what's the problem? Public perception, he says. People believe myths about nuclear, and it's time to set the record straight. And he has a little chart there, and I'm going to mention some of these to you, and then I'll get you to weigh in about nuclear, because where you live in your area, you're quite familiar with nuclear energy. So I'll read a couple of the myths. We'll put a graphic up on screen. So myth, nuclear power isn't safe. Nuclear power waste is a big problem. Nuclear increases electricity prices. We're going to run out of nuclear fuel. Nuclear plants take too long to build. Most Americans don't want nuclear power plants. Of course, you could put that into Canadians and North Americans. Then he lists some facts, okay? Fact, nuclear power is just as safe as solar and wind. Nuclear waste is safely contained and recyclable. Places with nuclear power have below average electricity prices. There's enough nuclear fuel to build there's enough nuclear fuel to power civilization for 4 billion years. Large plants average 7 years to build. Small plants can be built in less than 3 years. He goes on from there. So, again, you know about nuclear energy. It's in Ontario. There's a plant in New Brunswick as well. Your thoughts on nuclear energy and how Canada could leverage it?
Well, I think there's a time, and of course, President Jimmy Carter would probably be the first one to attest to it when he came up to Canada and helped save the Chalk River plant that we had there. But in the 1960s and 70s, Ontario moved ahead of most jurisdictions in North America by building a fleet of nuclear reactors, most of them in my old riding of Pickering. They were the first commercial nuclear reactors that gave us not just an abundance of energy, but clean energy, and more importantly, at a fraction of the price. And although it wasn't cool and trendy back in those days to talk about the climate, the greater interest was how does a province with no oil and no hydrology that it supports what Quebec's doing or Manitoba's doing or Newfoundland is doing, that's how the hydrology so that dam systems actually work. They put a lot of money into that, and they didn't just build one; they built 3 nuclear plants in Ontario. Had an economic boom that was unprecedented because of those cheap energy prices. And we've lost our way a little bit. We've allowed, certain groups out there who are already down on nuclear to undermine the idea of building more, and they're costly and that they're dangerous, and it becoming morphed into how they're used for non-peaceful purposes, as we're seeing with respects to, say, for instance, Iran's ambitions. There was a problem, of course, with Pakistan and India, but that's from a generation ago. Not all wisdom is new wisdom. And we're going back to recognizing that building nuclear is the way to go forward. If we want, we want to settle this argument between those who think that the sky is not falling and those that do. Nuclear is the way, and with newer technologies on smart, small modular reactors, which are now starting to be considered over the next 5 to 10 years. I think Canada is very well placed to being able to build those to use in remote communities that normally use, a diesel. So I'm thinking here of northern Canada. So the opportunities are there, and I think Canada is a leader in nuclear, not just in terms of how we've deployed it in the past, but a little place called Saskatchewan that uses and has a heck of a lot of a deposit of uranium. Forget the potash and the oil and natural gas there. They're leaders globally in uranium. So I think we're onto something, and this may be where consensus leads us to saying build more nukes, and at the same time ensure that we have flexibility in places where we need it, where natural gas and other products and hydro can back it up. Bottom line, Scott, the beauty of Canada is our diversity of an eclectic diversity of energy menus. We have a number of ways of creating reliable energy, not just for base load, but for peaker, for intermittency. So when you need more energy, you can get more energy on hot days or cold days, and vice versa. So we're in the driver's seat here, and nuclear has to be part of that going forward.
Dan, we've certainly covered a lot of bases. Before we wind up with you here, anything else since we spoke last week that's kind of caught your attention and raised an eyebrow?
The issue of affordability, it has a number of, manifests itself in a number of ways, but one of the ones that I think Stats Canada just released today, Scott, was the concern that the requirement of consumers now to, dedicate 15 to 16% of their disposable income just to support the financing of their homes or for what they have in terms of vehicles or credit is at an alarming level, the highest since 1990. And I think we're going to have to be more focused and more deliberate on asking the fundamental question of the Bank of Canada. At what point does inflation, which seems to be under control, become less of a concern? And when do we start to see some relief? Because this cannot continue without bankrupting a good number of consumers who are really at the wall. And I don't need to mention that to you. We hear from these people all the time. They're the ones that we have to target. But, this brings us back to 1990, very difficult economic times. And I think we have to be very cognizant of these kind of stats, which, in my view, underscore the angst that most Canadians are facing, and much of it, I believe, unnecessary.
Dan, we're glad to have you with us each Wednesday on Prices at the Pumps here at SaltWire to wade through these topics and these issues, and also to get updates on where prices are headed, because that's an immediate thing that consumers want to know. But when you're not with us here at SaltWire, there's other places that folks can find you, right? Where are they?
Yeah, president at affordableenergy.ca, good way to contact me. You can see my gas price predictions at gaswizard.ca. And of course, the site itself, when I'm not on those working to update those prices, I'm always my Twitter, Gas Price Wizard, is always a decent way of knowing where I'm at. It's kind of salty, a little bit of fun, but no holds barred. And remember, I'm not a politician. I'm like everyone else here. Citizen Dan takes time to look at what you have to say, may not agree with it, but at least we've shared our differences. And I think that's very much the Canadian way.
It is indeed, Dan. And again, we're glad to be able to chat with you once a week here at SaltWire. Now, Dan, before we completely wrap it up here, speaking of wrapping, how's the Christmas preparations going? Do you have all the gifts bought that you need to get? Are you still on Santa's nice list?
Oh, I think I'm off Santa's nice list. So it's a question of redeeming in the next, over the next 9 days to see if there's some way in which Rudolph might be able to make a quick diversion and drop off a few things. But if anything, a set of rotors and brake pads would certainly come in handy, as well as maybe another vehicle under the Christmas tree, and an internal combustion one, because I believe in reliability.
Well, the funny thing is, Dan, I look at what excites me now for potential Christmas gifts at the stage of life that I'm at compared to when I was 10, 12, 13 years old. Very different things now get me excited about Christmas presents. Brake pads, routers, a really nice knife for cutting, would be a great thing. A really good cutting board. Oh, a nice frying pan, Dan. A good frying pan. Oh, goodness. Those are the things that get me excited now.
Well, I think some frying pans around this house have been thrown in my direction by my wife because I spent a little bit too much time on energy, not enough time on keeping the house clean.
We should get a hidden camera there and have behind the scenes footage of Dan McTagg in the household. We'll call it the flying
laws in this country.
Anyway, Dan, always a pleasure to chat with you. We've got one more before the holiday hiatus and break. We'll do that next Wednesday. Until then, have a great rest of the day. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk to you next Wednesday.
Thanks so much, Scott. Great to be here on SaltWire as always.
Thank you, Dan.